Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 23 October 2024. It is the 97th anniversary of the birth of Leszek Kołakowski, who was born in Radom, Poland, on this date in 1927. Kołakowski was a student of Kotarbiński, who was in turn a student of Twardowski. The Polish philosophical tradition is one of the most impressive of Europe, including figures like Leszniczki and Twardowski. And apologies that I do not know how to pronounce these Polish names correctly, but I'll give it the best shot that I can. It's one of the most remarkable features of Polish intellectual life in the second half of the 20th century that despite the country being under the control of a communist regime during the Cold War, the philosophical tradition was virtually free of the kind of intellectual capture that characterized the Soviet Union and most of its dependent states. In the works of Kotarbiński, Łukasiewicz, Adzhukowicz, and others who became to be collectively known as the Lvov-Warsaw School, we see the purest philosophical spirit in evidence, uncontaminated by any political agenda. Although Kołakowski appeared within this milieu, he was not among the philosophers who focused exclusively on logic and metaphysics, like the Lvov-Warsaw School, though I suspect the elevated philosophical climate in which he was working made his own independence of mind possible. Kołakowski saw himself as a Marxist, and he wrote extensively in the Marxist tradition of philosophy. We could say that he was an internal critic of Marxism because although he counted himself a Marxism, he was always critical. And it was this critical stance toward Marxism, despite being a Marxist, that eventually got him in trouble with the authorities in Poland. He might be considered more a philosopher engaged with contemporary events than a philosopher of history in the strict sense, but contemporary events are history too, which I emphasized in my episode on Karl Jaspers, and a philosophical engagement with contemporary history has much to teach us about philosophy of history. Kołakowski covered a wide range of topics. For example, he wrote a book on positivism, the alienation of reason, and a book on phenomenology, Husserl and the search for certitude. And he found similar thematic motives in these apparently different philosophical movements. For Kołakowski, both logical positivism and phenomenology represented the pursuit of an epistemological absolute. The pursuit of an absolute, of any absolute, adds a teleological dimension to history. And as such, the work of Husserl and the logical positivists, insofar as it seeks an epistemological absolute, isn't merely an epistemological idea, although it is that as well. It's more than an epistemological ideal, because we can say the goal of this teleology is an absolute, and that makes it an eschatological quest, the most recent permutation of the perennial human quest to grasp something greater than ourselves. At the end of his book on Husserl, Kołakowski characterized Husserl's pursuit of an epistemological absolute in this way. Quote, "The search for certitude is unlikely to be given up, and we may doubt if it would be desirable to stop it. The search has little to do with the progress of science and technology. Its background is religious rather than intellectual. It is, as Husserl perfectly knew, a search for meaning. I should end by saying that my intention was not to suggest that Husserl's quest for the new transcendental rationality was of the same source of perfect certainty." Let me begin that sentence again. I should end by saying that my intention was not to suggest that Husserl's quest for the new transcendental rationality and of the source of perfect certainty was worthless. I think that his attempt failed to reach its goal, as indeed I suspect all attempts to get at the epistemological absolute are bound to fail, unquote. And of the logical empiricists, he has to say. From the point, quote, from the point of view of applied knowledge, the desire for an epistemological absolute, that is to say, metaphysical certainty, is fruitless. And those in quest of this certainty were perfectly aware of the fact. And yet, we repeat, philosophy has never given up its attempt to constitute an autonomous reason, independent of technological applications and irreducible to purely recording functions, unquote. Kolakowski also introduced larger themes in his book on positivism. The penultimate chapter of this book is titled Logical Empiricism, a Scientific Defense of a Threatened Civilization. Despite the interesting ideas implicit in this chapter title, Kolakowski doesn't explain or develop these ideas, though I would say that since this is the title of the chapter, the ideas are implicit throughout. So he doesn't exactly explain what he means by scientism, although we understand readily enough that this is supposed to be an ideology derived from science, but not identical with science. Twice earlier in the book, before discussing logical empiricism, Kolakowski gives a brief account of what he understands by scientism, although these two accounts don't precisely tally. So in one of these, he says, quote, scientism, that is, the doctrine according to which any question that cannot be settled by the methods of the natural and deductive sciences is an improper question, and every statement containing an answer to an improper question is itself improper, or more precisely, meaningless, unquote. And then a little further along, he says, quote, it professes scientism, that is, it asserts the essential unity of the scientific method, accounting for differences between the sciences on this score, especially between the social and physical sciences, by the immaturity of the former, though it is believed they will eventually be modeled on the latter, unquote. So Kolakowski is attributing to scientism the denial of the meaningfulness of any non-scientific question, as well as the unity of scientific method. These two ways of thinking about scientism aren't mutually exclusive, and I could argue that the two ideas are mutually reinforcing, that there is one and only one scientific method, and anything beyond the reach of this method lies outside the scope of legitimate rational inquiry, are positions that support each other. My point in bringing this up is that we don't get an unambiguous account of scientism in the book on positivism that culminates in equating logical empiricism with scientism. And Kolakowski doesn't tell us what the threatened civilization is in this chapter title or why it's threatened. But we can gather from the 20th century context in which he wrote, with its pervasive change and pervasive fear, which is probably a function of change, that he means contemporaneous Western civilization, which is presumably assailed on all sides by existential threats. We can imagine the existential threats that Kolakowski might have cited in the middle of the 20th century, like nuclear war, pollution, and population. And we can equally well imagine the existential threats that are cited today when similar concerns for the future of civilization are raised. Kolakowski doesn't tell us how the scientism of logical empiricism is supposed to act as a defense of this threatened civilization. But again, we can infer from the context that this rationalistic civilization in which science has come to play an outsized role in comparison to what it was in earlier civilizations requires a scientific defense of its scientific conceptual framework. I wish Kolakowski had made all of this explicit, and it's entirely possible that someone who knows the whole of Kolakowski's work, which I don't, could provide the references. But there's enough in this book to see that what Kolakowski was getting at was the kind of philosophy of history that Husserl advanced in his last years, and which I discussed in my episode on Husserl. Husserl saw European civilization threatened by irrationalism, and argued that it was the rationalistic tradition of Western thought that was distinctive and was, in his time, distinctively threatened. I said earlier that Kawakowski found a pursuit of an epistemic absolute in both Husserl and the logical empiricists. And we could, I think, reasonably describe Husserl's philosophy of science, philosophy of history, as a scientific defense of a threatened civilization, no less than the logical empiricists to which Kawakowski attributed this. And Husserl did quite explicitly, more so than the logical empiricists, state that he was defending or was calling for a renewal, you could say, of European civilization. So he makes explicit this defense of a threatened civilization in the way that the logical empiricists did not. Kawakowski finds that both of these efforts, those of phenomenology and positivism alike, to have failed, but he believed that the quest itself remained worthwhile. We can debate the relative merit of pursuing an unattainable epistemic ideal, and here I don't necessarily disagree with Kawakowski, but at least in one respect, Kawakowski turned out to be dead wrong. Near the end of The Alienation of Reason, he wrote, quote, "We are today in a better position than ever before, thanks to more exact definitions of the scientific attitude and the scientific admissibility of assertions, to counteract the ideological misuse of science. In other words, ability to give a relatively good definition of the boundaries of scientific validity, an ability developed largely thanks to the positivists, is of great importance when we must criticize the claims of doctrinaires who invoke the authority of science in support of their slogans." Unquote. Subsequent history has shown us that the ideological misuse of science has only grown since Kawakowski wrote this, and it threatens to get worse over time. And it's not difficult to understand why this is the case. The growth of the status of science means that non-scientific claims in pursuit of the kind of status that science enjoys will seek to attach themselves to science so as to bask in the reflected glow of science, or if you prefer another metaphor, to hitch its wagon to a star. For philosophers, science is straightforwardly about the pursuit of knowledge. For the vulgar, science is a form of legitimation. Individuals or movements seeking legitimacy consequently will be drawn to science as a source of legitimation. The pursuit of legitimation through science will lead to always more elaborate efforts to imitate the appearance of science in order to benefit from the apparent legitimation this provides. Of course, one of the appeals that Marxism made was precisely this, its claim to being a scientific philosophy. That is to say, science was seen as a source of legitimation for Marxists who believed Marx's work to be scientific. Kawakowski, though far from being an orthodox Marxist, is still responding to the siren song of the scientificity of the tradition of Marxism. Quote, "When one attains an unshakable and absolute certainty that heaven is just around the corner, no wonder that one messianic hope becomes the unique governor of life, the sole source of moral precepts, and the only measure of virtue. This apocalyptic philosophy of history, which Joachim de Fiore and Thomas Müntzer expounded, found its way in a certain form into the communist movement. Although in the latter, it was supported by honest and fertile scientific analysis, in practice, it acted upon the mass movement as a messianic vision." Unquote. This is from Kawakowski's History and Responsibility, a 4-part essay originally published as a series of articles in 1957, and which was included in the volume Marxism and Beyond on Historical Understanding and Individual Responsibility, originally published in English in 1969. In this essay, After invoking the dispute between realism and utopianism, Kawakowski explicitly formulated 6 assumptions that he calls anti-realist. And no, this isn't the anti-realism of contemporary analytical philosophers, but an anti-realism conceived to redeem whatever remains defensible within utopianism and therefore opposed to a presumptive realism, and in the sense of realism being opposed to utopianism. Some of these are formulated as complete sentences, while others are put forward to him as individual words. And so here's his 6 assumptions. First assumptions: ethical individualism. Only human beings and their deeds are subject to moral judgment. Second assumption: determinism. Here he only gives the single word, but he elaborates on this a little further on in the text. Quote, opinions about good and evil and about the morality of people's behavior are determined by the way an individual participates in society. So he's not here talking about the kind of a metaphysical determinism that Nietzsche postulated in his Eternal Recurrence, which I mentioned in a recent episode. This is the determinism of an individual by their environment to some degree. Third assumption, the humanistic interpretation of values. Fourth assumption, the historical interpretation of value. Duty is a form of existence. Fifth assumption, the negation of the pseudo-realistic criticism of moralistic utopias. Sixth assumption, the possibility of ethical judgment of political choices. The fundamental political choices we make are subject to moral judgment. Each of these 6 assumptions are developed and elaborated over several pages, and they are interspersed with comments on the philosophy of history, such as this. Quote, a philosophy of history worthy of respect describes only what has already in some manner come into existence, that is, only the past, not the future creations of the historical process. Therefore, those who attempt to organize their own involvement in predicted processes according to what the philosophy of history suggests are like tourists who scribble their names on the walls of dead cities. Everyone can, if he wishes, interpret himself historically and unearth the determining factors that made him what he is, his past. But he cannot do the same for the self he has not yet become, unquote. As the author of History and Responsibility, Kawakowski was still a convinced socialist, and even, we might say, a utopian socialist. But he seemed to understand the threat to free inquiry that ideology represents to science. And of this, he formulated 4 points. Quote, first of all, any political restriction on the subject matter of scientific research is damaging. Second, it is equally harmful in a field that is subject to scientific research to announce that certain truths are politically correct and to demand that they are disseminated without regard to scientific discussion. Third, to lay down certain directions for research in scientific circles is dangerous in humanistic studies because it often conceals a demand that they supply arguments for views accepted beforehand as being correct. Fourth, it is both dangerous and irresponsible to establish a sphere of untouchable truths that are excluded from discussion, unquote. Those were Kawakowski's concerns in Poland in the 60s. They are now, or they ought to be, everyone's concerns throughout the Western world today. In his main currents of Marxism, its origins, growth, and dissolution, Kawakowski mentions the usual subjects of French Marxist interpretations of Hegel's philosophy of history, starting with the Russian emigre Alexander Kojève, whom I've mentioned in my episodes on Raymond Aron and Isaiah Berlin. Quote, in lectures published in 1947, Kojève presented the phenomenology as a history of man's self-creation by dint of laboring and struggling. In the dialectic of master and servant, he perceived the source of Marx's theory of the proletariat and the idea of work as a demiurge of history, unquote. And then Kawakowski moves on to Jean Hyppolite. Quote, Kojève and Hyppolite showed Marx's philosophy of history to be a continuation of the Hegelian dialectic of negation. Evil slavery, and alienation being the necessary means whereby mankind achieves self-understanding and liberation. Hippolyte emphasized in particular that, for Hegel as for Marx, reason was not a transcendental observer of the world with its own rules independent of the course of history, but it was itself a factor, aspect, or expression of history, and that the progress of mankind toward rationality was not a matter of gradually assimilating ready-made rules of thought, but of a growing sense of community and acknowledgement of rationality in others. For that purpose, it was necessary that human beings should cease to function as commodities, and this was Marx's principal message, unquote. As a Marxist apostate, Kawakowski drew the wrath of prominent Marxists in the West, which resulted in an exchange with the English historian E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson was the prototypical Marxist academic. He was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and he founded the Communist Party Historians Group. Thompson, together with Christopher Hill, Eric Hobsbawm, Rodney Hilton, and Donna Torr, launched the journal Past and Present. I've discussed his colleague Christopher Hill in 2 episodes, and I tried to give a sense of Hill's longing for a counterfactual communist utopia in early modern England that never happened. And I did this to try to give a sense of how far gone some of these Marxist historians are. Thompson withdrew from the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1956 after the Hungarian uprising, but he continued his historical work in a Marxist vein, writing about labor history and social history. His most famous book is The Making of the English Working Class. The preface starts out in an explicitly Marxist vein by discussing class and class consciousness in England, but near the end of his preface, Thompson has a moment in which he transcends his tiresome Marxism and delivers himself of this oft-quoted passage, quote, "I am seeking to rescue the poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott from the enormous condescension of posterity. Their crafts and traditions may have been dying. Their hostility to the new industrialism may have been backward-looking. Their communitarian ideals may have been fantasies. Their insurrectionary conspiracies may have been foolhardy. But they lived through these times of acute social disturbance, and we did not. Their aspirations were valid in terms of their own experience, and if they were casualties of history, they remain condemned in their own lives as casualties," unquote. The idea of aspirations being valid in terms of their own experience, even if they're not valid in terms of our experience, since we inhabit a very different social and economic milieu, is a formulation of historicism that I think deserves more attention. And I don't know of anyone who has tried to further develop this. So Thompson had his better moments, but his exchange with Kawakowski was not one of them, though it remains well worth reading because it foreshadows so much that was to come in the culture wars of our own time. Kawakowski noted that Raymond Williams called Thompson's 100-page-long open letter to Leszek Kawakowski one of the best pieces of left writings of the last decade. And truly enough, it's written in an engaging conversational style that makes it sound like a real letter. Thompson wrote his open letter to Kawakowski in 1973, and Kawakowski responded in 1974 with about a 20-page essay titled "My Correct Views on Everything." I'm only going to quote a short passage from this in which he summarizes his objection to Thompson's method in Thompson's open letter. Quote, "I found it regrettable to see in your letter so many leftist cliches which survive in speech and print owing to 3 devices. First, the refusal to analyze words and the use of verbal hybrids purposely designed to confound the issues. Second, the use of moral or sentimental standards in some cases and of political and historical standards in other similar cases. Third, the refusal to accept historical facts as they are," unquote. The exchange between Thompson and Kawakowski shows how almost nothing has been learned in the past 50 years since academic Marxists like Thompson continue to pursue the same methods to this day. I should note that there's no intrinsic reason that social history must be Marxist, and in many historians, it isn't. In my episode on Christopher Hill, I quoted from Peter Laslitt's The World We Have Lost, England Before the Industrial Age, which could be taken as an example of non-Marxist social history. But the fact remains that a great deal of social history follows in the tradition of E.P. Thompson and Christopher Hill, where it is inspired by an explicitly Marxist perspective. That is to say, there is a dominant philosophy of history in social history, and that is Marxist philosophy of history, and that means that other philosophies of history are implicitly excluded. So that was something of a digression on social history, but now I want to return to Kawakowski, who, despite being purged from the Polish Communist Party, losing his professorship in Warsaw, and being attacked by Marxists from Western Europe, continued to identify as a communist. In History and Responsibility, from which I quoted earlier, Kawakowski wrote, quote, "Regardless of what philosophy of history we may wish to accept, we will be rightly judged for everything subject to moral appraisal that we do in its name. And it is not true that our philosophy of history decides our main choices in life. They are determined by our moral sense. We are not communists because we recognize communism to be a historical necessity. We are communists because we stand on the side of the oppressed against their oppressors, on the side of the wretches against their masters, on the side of the persecuted against their persecutors," unquote. So in that passage, Kawakowski is coming out very explicitly against the idea that the end justifies the means, and saying we can be judged on moral principles for what he does or what others do in the name of communism. Given the anti-realist assumptions I quoted earlier, Kawakowski seems to believe in a kind of spiritualized form of Marxism in which individual moral responsibility plays a central role. His moral concern is central, and he identifies his communism as following from his moral concerns. Despite professions such as this of his explicit identification as a communist, Kawakowski's status as an internal critic of Marxism led him to become persona non grata in Poland. In 1966, he was dismissed from the Polish Communist Party, and in 1968, he was purged from Warsaw University and prevented from taking another academic post in Poland, so he became a visiting professor at McGill University. Forced out of Poland, Kawakowski seems to have drifted away from Marxism. More than 30 years later, in his speech, What the Past is For, given at the Coolidge Auditorium on 5 November 2003, his conception of history begins to sound more like Raymond Aron, who called history tyrannical and aimless, and Karl Löwit, after Löwit felt that he had disposed with traditional philosophy of history and found himself something at loose ends as a result. For Löwit, philosophy of history was at loose ends because traditional eschatology could no longer be taken seriously as a source of secularized conceptions of progress. For Kawakowski, philosophy of history was at loose ends because the eschatology of a spiritualized Marxism no longer held the appeal it once held for him. Philosophy seems to become largely pointless. History seems to have become largely pointless. Quote, "It is indeed arguable that we cannot use our historical knowledge to help us in our present work. It may be true that whatever people know about the great military exploits of Alexander the Great or Hannibal would not be of much use in improving the skills of today's generals, and that knowledge of the political intrigues of the French royal court in the 17th century would not be of much help to a contemporary politician," unquote. So here he's putting it rather bluntly, but this isn't a new idea for Kawakowski. In his book on positivism, he emphasized that the pursuit of an epistemic absolute by the logical empiricists had no utility at all in terms of a science that bears upon technology and so influences the ordinary business of life. Recall that this pursuit of an epistemic absolute in positivism and phenomenology was, for Kawakowski, a kind of eschatological project. Kawakowski has now come to the point that not only the ideal epistemological absolute of logical positivism bakes no bread, but even the mere knowledge of history, not necessarily an ideal attainment of knowledge, is of little or no use. This is still, in a sense, the technological argument that Kawakowski made decades earlier, but now generalized to the point that historical knowledge of ancient strategy or politics provides no insights for contemporary generals or politicians. Kawakowski continued, quote, however, the limited technical support to be gained from an acquaintance with historical events is not a good reason for concluding that historical knowledge is irrelevant to our life. We are the cultural, though not necessarily physical, heirs of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and French monarchs. And to say that their lives, their deeds and misdeeds, do not matter to our lives would be almost as silly as saying that it would not matter to me if I were to suddenly erase my memory, my own past personal life, just because, obviously, I live in the present, not in the past. The history of past generations is our history, and we need to know it in order to be aware of our identity. In the same sense in which my own memory builds my personal identity, makes me a human subject, unquote. Kawakowski believes that acquaintance with historical events is valuable in spite of the lack of utility of this acquaintance. Rather, acquaintance with history is useful not because it's applicable, but because it is a source of identity. History is the social equivalent of memory, and as memory makes it possible for us to have a personal identity, history makes it possible for us to have a social and cultural identity. Although history is a source of identity, it isn't, or it shouldn't be, a myth. Quote, although the legacy of myth is certainly an important and fertile source in human culture, we must defend and support traditional research methods elaborated over centuries to establish the factual course of history and separate it from fantasies, however nourishing those fantasies might be. The doctrine that there are no facts, only interpretations, should be rejected as obscurantist, unquote. The idea that there are no facts, only interpretation, is due in its explicit form to Nietzsche. So Kawakowski is rejecting Nietzsche's position as obscurantist. And he continues, quote, we must preserve our traditional belief that the history of mankind, the history of things that really happened, woven of innumerable unique accidents, is the history of each of us, human subjects, whereas the belief in historical laws is a figment of the imagination, unquote. Here we have an echo of Popper and the many philosophers, including philosophers of history, who have rejected the very idea that there could be laws of history. So for Kawakowski, history is about facts and not about mythology, but at the same time, these facts are not connected by any laws. History consists of innumerable accidents, making it little more than random. Nevertheless, Kawakowski sees value in the accidents of history. Quote, historical knowledge is crucial to each of us, to school children and students, to young and old. We must absorb history as our own, with all its horrors and monstrosities, as well as its beauty and splendor, its cruelties and persecutions, as well as the magnificent works of the human mind and hand. We must do this if we are to know our proper place in the universe, to know who we are and how we should act, unquote. Knowing our proper place in the universe sounds to me like a Copernican theme, but our place in the universe is no random accident of nature. Our place in the universe is the kind of place where beings like us can evolve. And this can be generalized and extended to human history as well. Our civilization, or our culture, is a function of the kind of society that can evolve in the places where they have, in fact, evolved. Before industrializations, the food you ate were those that could be cultivated locally, and the foods that could be grown locally shaped the culture of those who cultivated these foods. Different farming techniques are integrated into different ways of life. So these things aren't random. We might not be able to give a very satisfactory account of the laws that connect the apparently unique accidents that cumulatively constitute history, but that's no reason to give up on the attempt to understand. But by now I'm starting to see that a whole generation of philosophers, if not an entire century of philosophers of history, first disappointed by Hegel and then disappointed by Marx, gave up on any attempt to grasp history as being, in any sense, intelligible. Since they were witnesses to the catastrophe of the 20th century, I can't blame them, but we don't need to be bound by the limitations of the disappointment of a previous generation. Happy birthday, Leszek Kołakowski. So let me know what I've missed or what I've gotten wrong in the comments, and thanks for listening.